I'm Agnieszka Niemark, and this is the Boyce Thompson Institute Centennial Oral History Project. It's November 27, 2023. My interviewee today is Dr. Laura Phillips, co-founder, president, and CEO of Spherix Incorporated. Dr. Phillips served on the BTI Board of Directors between 2006 and 2018. She was the co-vice chair of the board 2009-2013 and the chair of the board between 2014 and 2018. Laura, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to participate in this project.
It's my pleasure.
So, just for the record, I wanted to mention again that you became a BTI board member in 2006. At the time, Ezra Cornell was the chair of the board, Roy Park Jr. was the vice chair, and David Stern just became the president of the Institute around 2004. Yeah. Could you explain how your story with BTI Board of Directors started? How you remember these initial years on the board?
Well, I had been at Cornell on the faculty first in the chemistry department, and then later I got my MBA from the Johnson Business School. So I was familiar with Cornell and the campus, and I knew of BTI, but I didn't really know very much about it. Then Ezra Cornell had been a longtime friend and contact, and he knew of a lot of my activities while I was in Ithaca on the board of Planned Parenthood in Ithaca. I chaired the board of Planned Parenthood in New York City. I had a lot of interactions on not-for-profit boards. He approached me and said there might be an opportunity that was a good match for me at BTI. So I learned more about BTI, and I certainly was very familiar with Cornell University, and it is on the campus at Cornell University, although an independent entity. It collaborates a great deal with Cornell. And the caliber of research at BTI was incredibly impressive. So I became interested, and I accepted the opportunity. I began because of my finance experience, my expertise in being able to read and understand financial statements, so I joined the finance committee as my first committee responsibility as a member of the board.
Okay. Tell us a little bit more about your educational background and your work experience, because you have a variety of professional experiences as a scientist first, as a chemist, then also in the federal agencies and in private sector. So could you tell us about the experiences that were the most useful for serving on BTI board?
I think almost all of my experience through my circuitous professional path have brought some value to the board at BTI. I started out with a PhD in physical chemistry and joined the faculty at Cornell in the chemistry department, and I was there for several years, but found that the academic world wasn't the best fit for me. So then I was going out into the world to find out what other arenas there might be for me to deploy my skills in science, and I've always been a scientist at heart and will be for my entire life. It's at my core. So the next thing I did was I went to Washington just on a year fellowship to be a technology advisor to Congress, and thought that would just be a year while I sorted things out. But that led to a White House fellowship where I was in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and from there I became the presidential appointee to be the senior policy advisor to the Secretary of Commerce, who was Ron Brown at the time. And at the Department of Commerce, the Clinton administration viewed technology as a real economic driver for the country. So the idea was we wanted to find a way to make sure that all of this innovative technology that was being developed in an academic arena was able to transfer out and become successful companies. So when I was working with all of these small companies and finding out how to make them successful and what kind of role the government could play in fostering their development and growth, I said, that's where I want to be. I want to do entrepreneurial kinds of activities. So I went back and got an MBA at Cornell and where my husband was on the faculty, so there was that draw to get back to Cornell as well. So I got my MBA, and then I got an offer I couldn't refuse from Corning Incorporated, and served in a variety of different executive positions over several years at Corning. So then I had the experience at a really well-run, innovation-driven company, and learned even more than one could learn in business school about how to be a successful entrepreneur. So then I went out on my own and worked in a number of different entrepreneurial early-stage startup companies, starting in around, I think, 2001, 2002. And then by 2014, I was ready to have one of my own. So I went in search of intellectual property and found intellectual property that I thought was once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to in-license from NYU. So I had that experience of in-licensing technology and starting a company based on that technology. And so for the last 9 years, I've been involved in running that company. So I've done research and managed research in a variety of different settings. I've done converting research activity into an actual commercial product. So the idea is only the very beginning, and then it has to be nurtured and fostered and developed into a successful commercial product that is then desirable by a customer base in order to be a successful company. So all of those different pieces, I think, were valuable in my role at BTI.
Yeah, and they came together around the time when you basically joined also the board.
Yes, yes.
So Laura, one of the important developments at BTI happened during your initial years on the board. So in 2008, BTI started to work on a first strategic plan for the institution. Could you talk about this process and, what was the outcome of it?
I am a huge fan of strategic planning. I think it's a critical element to any significant organization. The board as a whole decided that strategic planning was something that was needed at BTI. I had a lot of experience in strategic planning. I ran the strategic planning activity at the Department of Commerce, and that was a particularly challenging activity because it was in the midst of a lot of disagreement about what the Department of Commerce should be. And there are a lot of different parts that one has to think about. How do they all fit successfully under a single umbrella? So really working through what is the strategy of the Department of Commerce and how do all of these parts fit successfully together was a very good background for coming to BTI and now thinking about what should be the strategic plan for BTI. Initially, the organization, even David Stern, was quite leery of the idea of implementing a strategic plan. They didn't want to waste a lot of time creating a document that just was going to sit on the shelf and gather dust. And we as a board said, no, that is not our intention at all. What we want is a living, breathing strategic plan that we as a board would use to monitor and evaluate progress and decide whether we were on the correct trajectory and understand what that trajectory was over a 5-year time horizon, and that we expected the leadership of the organization to use that strategic plan to really operationalize it and use it as a management tool to progress the organization in the direction that we all agreed that we wanted to go. So it was a little bit difficult the first time around, but then the organization embraced it wholeheartedly. And by the time that 5-year strategic plan was nearing its end, the board hadn't even taken up the idea of it's time for another strategic plan. The organization came to us and said, here's our first draft of the strategic plan, let's talk about it. So it has been a just terrific success, and it's been really wonderful at helping us achieve some of the goals that have been achieved at BTI since that time.
Yes, so one of the elements of the strategic plan, this kind of top visible element is the mission for the institution, and I think this mission was a little bit like the formulation became clearer for BTI, stating that the institute should do research, basic research in plants field, but should also make impact in real life agriculture application, environmental applications, or health. So that was just the top of the planning. But as you said, there were other elements that were more at the technical level, how this could be used, right?
Exactly. When you start with a mission and vision, that's just the top. And then you have major strategic goals. So these should be thought of as buckets, but each of those have to be operationalized with clear tactical intent at a level that the board is not involved in. We're involved down to the strategic goal level. Board should operate at a strategy level, and then the organization operates with more of that tactical level. So they very successfully translated those strategic objectives down into the organization, and really the entire organization embraced it, which is quite remarkable for a research-driven organization. Researchers tend to want to be totally free to do what they want, which of course they are in one way, but in another way, we're talking about having an impact. And so how does all of this research fit together? And by having a clear vision of how all of the research fits into the total picture, it also fosters collaboration between different research groups and stimulates some of the synergy that is inherent in having these world-class researchers all under the same roof. So I think it had many ripple ramifications that were very positive for the organization.
So Laura, the first strategic plan covered the period of time 2009-2014, and just before the Institute started to work on a second strategic plan, you mentioned to me that David Stern was involved also in the decadal plant vision,
yes,
or plant science vision. Could you talk how this was related also to the creation of the strategy for BTI?
Sure. We were interested in the fact that as we looked at some of our peer institutions, they were getting more notoriety, I guess, more public awareness than we had at BTI. When we had the strategic plan in place, part of our concern was to get funding for more diverse sources, which is fostered and helped by a larger reputation out there in the world. And we also wanted to have a role in understanding where plant research could go most effectively. So we wanted to play a larger role in a larger group coming together with a vision for plant research. So having the strategic plan in place not only set that up as a goal, but it also created a management structure that enabled David to spend more of his energy, less of his energy internally, just managing, making sure the trains were running on time internally, and had more bandwidth to spend time outside of the organization, out in the world. And he then was able to participate in this decadal vision that was run by some of the major funding organizations in Washington. And after participating in it, he quickly became the leader of that activity and then was leading the decadal vision, so the long-term plan for how plant research was going to have a positive impact for the world more globally. So it became a very powerful construct that was the launch pad for many good outcomes.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, Laura, so during your time as a vice co-chair on the board and chair of the board, more or less 2010, 2018, what were the other important issues that the board tried to achieve?
So we also had a little bit of a change in how the board interacted with the research that was going on in the organization. Earlier, really, before my time, but even at the first part of my time on the board, there was a lot more technical expertise on the board. And technical expertise is great to understand the research that the organization is doing, but in terms of the things like the strategic planning or governance or financial management, that kind of skill base is not really needed at a board level. We also changed the view of what these technical people were doing. They were no longer providing oversight, but rather being advisors to the organization. So we had world-class scientists who were very happy to come and be advisors to this crown jewel of an organization with world-class research going on. It was really a plus to be involved in an advisory capacity, a scientific advisory capacity. But many folks that are really terrific at that role, not so interested in being involved in a board. So these were really almost disparate parts that were trying to be into one organization. So we'd already bifurcated that as I came on the board, and we created this separate entity, which was now called the Scientific Advisory Board. But a lot of the first part of my time was refining that and figuring out how did we, as a board, really continue to have that close touch with the research that was going on with the organization and understand the caliber. And we developed some metrics for how to understand the success and the reputation of the organization. And we decided that we really just needed a little bit of overlap between the Scientific Advisory Board and the Board of Directors. So we required that we had to have at least 2 overlap. But now that made serving on the Scientific Advisory Board much more attractive for the really technical people that we wanted to be involved at the organization. And it took the board of directors and removed some of that responsibility for doing scientific oversight, which was really not our role. So it was very successful.
And I just wanted to clarify, apart from the overlap with the board, the other members of the Scientific Advisory Board are external scientists, right? They are
Correct.
not involved directly in the research done at BTI. And in practice, Laura, did they produce just one report a year, which was then providing some information and some advice to the board? What's the collaboration between the board of directors and the scientific board?
The organization as a whole had matured to the point where the caliber of scientists at BTI no longer required something that would be considered oversight. They were now, you could see by their publications, by their grant money, there were many other metrics that we could use to make sure that the caliber of research was still at the level that we expected. But yet there is real value in bringing in some outside perspectives to interact with the scientists in the organization. So it was an annual event where there was a major report that was provided to the board of directors, but it was more of a sign-off from us that they had done their job well, rather than a judgment about the quality of research that was going on, that the board did.
And apart from the advice on the quality of the research and making sure that BTI produced this cutting-edge research, what were other important elements of this task of diversifying funding for BTI? What would you mention?
So the quality of research at BTI was, as I said, world-class, top quality. As a result, we were able to be very successful at getting the most difficult of research grants from places like NSF and NIH, and we had and even some of the more agriculturally based organizations as well. But these were very competitive areas, and we had more than our fair share of these grants. And these grants were, over the course of time, becoming more competitive and more challenging to get. And it seemed unwise to anticipate that we would have that same share of that pie, and that pie would continue to grow with the growth of the economy. So we wanted to make sure that we had other avenues that were also able to provide funding for the organization, including private grants, grants from foundations, from private industry. We also got very active in the idea of tech transfer of some of our intellectual property. We had some early success in intellectual property being a source of revenue for the organization, but it was not as concerted an effort. We set up a tech transfer office that really formalized the process of scientists being able to apply for patents without them having to navigate the whole very complex patent process. So now there was an office that, as long as the scientists could come in in and provide enough information to enable the office to have an invention disclosure and then determine whether it would be valuable for that invention disclosure to continue on to become a patent. So that just made that a much easier pathway.
Yeah, and I think apart from the protection of intellectual property, BTI also signed during the time your time on board, I think new materials transfer agreements also
Yes.
became an important part, since BTI, I think, has a lot of equipment of high quality and also, that could be useful to other institutes and institutions. I think
Yes.
these agreements also became important.
One of David Stern's incredible strengths was he was so willing to think outside the box and not accept everything as they are. When we said it was important for him to have more exposure outside of the organization, he goes out and becomes involved in this decadal vision and then runs it. When we were talking about diversifying the areas of funding, he was very proactive at going out and working with different industry and working with different even foundations, exploring different foundation paths. So he was really terrific at thinking about how can our intellectual property have an impact in the world. He was also very creative at the way that he would think about how were we going to hire people. BTI, because it sits on an academic campus and because we are competing with top-tier research institutions, universities, the leading research institutions, for the scientists that we were hiring, we had established a tenure process that was very parallel to that of big universities. And even big universities in this day and age are re-examining the tenure system. But David was very early on thinking about how do we get the very best of scientists and not necessarily think of them as being with us forever. But could we have people that would come in and be committed to BTI and want to stay at BTI and continue to produce at that high caliber and not be so wedded to the tenure system. He also came up with a really successful process for doing cluster hires, where we would hire people in adjacent fields, but all interested in the same larger field of research. And that proved to be quite powerful at stimulating a whole new area of research for the Institute by one set of cluster hires. And that was very exciting as he implemented that and put that into practice.
Yes, all these elements were quite important, I think, for the general posture of the institute in plant science. I think one aspect that I also wanted to discuss with you was also a collaboration with other plant institutes that were also leading in the field. So I think around 2014, also a collaboration with Danforth Plant Center and the Nobel Foundation was established to be sort of a closer collaborative experience. How important is that, Laura, this kind of being among these best institutes in this field?
I think that was also a wonderful advancement, and I've got to give David a lot of credit for that as well. As I said, he was willing to think outside of the box, so instead of thinking of us as competitors, he thought of us all as collaborators, that we could just make the pie bigger by all of us being really successful. And that was part of his leadership that positioned him as the leader for the decadal vision. So it was a really rather novel way to think about, rather than we were trying to get the same scientists or the same dollars, that how could we just all together raise the level of plant science. And that was very exciting.
So one of the examples of application of the research done at BTI is also establishment of some startups that got exclusive license for using certain technologies and techniques developed at BTI. Could you, Laura, talk about this in context of your own personal experience in co-founding Spherex as one of these kind of companies?
Sure. So any research, turning it into a commercial entity, is filled with risk. There's an enormous amount of uncertainty about how the company will evolve, how the commercial product will evolve. So it's a very challenging thing to establish the right balance in the license of how does the ownership shift from the institution to the company and who has what share of whatever success happens going forward. And I experienced this very personally in founding Spirix when we in-licensed the intellectual property from NYU, which at the time was a very abstract methodology for detecting particles in fluids. And we turned what was then run by 2 graduate students carefully adjusting little components on an enormous optical table into an instrument that's in a box that sits on a lab bench that is now used in the top 10 pharmaceutical companies to develop their drugs faster and to make sure that they're safe. So we had a technology that was just not available, that was not possible. We were able to detect contaminants or impurities in biopharmaceuticals that were undetectable. Similarly, we developed this technology to look at the clumps that can happen in slurries that polish semiconductors that are polished to nanometer scale flatness. If there's clumps in the polishing slurry, it scratches instead of polishes. And those kind of scratches create $1 billion in waste every year in the electronics industry. If we can eliminate that waste, we make products faster, we decrease the costs of your computers or your phones. So both of these were unmet needs in the industries that we're now just selling into. So it was very exciting technology, and it was a long path of many years taking this from the graduate students on an optical table into the inner workings of some of these major pharmaceutical and semiconductor companies. So that's where we are hoping from a BTI perspective that some of these seeds, these ideas, can be the foundation of companies. And we need to have some knowledgeable people on our side negotiating with these entrepreneurs to figure out what is the appropriate ownership or royalties or whatever the license contains.
Because these discoveries can be financially important for the institution, right? If the process is...
If the company is successful. But it is a many years activity. So it's not something that is going to be like a grant that you write a proposal and a year later you may have the funding. This may take many, many years before it comes to fruition. But it is potentially quite lucrative in the fullness of time.
Yes. Laura, so BTI moved to Cornell campus in the mid-70s. It was first located in Yonkers, New York. And I just wanted to ask you about the connections between BTI as an independent institution, but placed on the campus of Cornell, and how this might impact the visibility of the institute, collaborations with different schools related to plant research at Cornell, and also position of BTI outside Cornell.
So it really is quite remarkable that this relatively small research institute, certainly small compared to Cornell University, which is this behemoth research institution, that this is really quite a crown jewel. It is a powerhouse of top quality research in the field, so much so that it has a stellar international reputation for the caliber of research that is conducted at BTI. But at the same time, it sits on the corner of the campus of this major Ivy League research institution. So BTI has been very successful at fostering relationships with Cornell that allow both to benefit from that kind of collaboration. Many of the researchers at BTI have adjunct appointments at Cornell. Graduate students from Cornell can work at BTI under the guidance of the scientists at BTI. So there's this not completely seamless, but virtually seamless relationship that happens between Cornell and BTI. And it really is a very symbiotic relationship that is beneficial to everyone involved. it's a kind of unique situation where there can be these two top quality world-class institutions with such disparity in size, yet both operate in their own spheres very successfully and then very successfully collaborating.
And could you tell us a few words about your friendship with Ezra Cornell and also his position on the board of BTI for many years?
So Ezra is, of course, the descendant of the original Ezra Cornell who founded Cornell University, and he's been a trustee at Cornell for 50 years or so, and he's, I think, the youngest of the Cornell family that has been on the board of trustees. He is a wonderful person, a great friend, a very clever, intelligent person with great vision. I was quite honored when he approached me to be on the board at BTI, so it was certainly my good fortune to know him and be involved in that way. He served on the board for a significant part of the time that I was there, and then approached me to be chair of the board, which was quite a surprise to me. I thought he was approaching me. We knew that he was getting ready to step down, and I thought he was approaching me as a person to brainstorm with about who might be the next chair of the board. And it was quite startling and quite an honor to be asked by him to be the next chair to succeed him on the board of directors. I was the first woman to be a chair of the board of BTI, which is also exciting. I think those kinds of barriers are always good to break down and make easier for the next woman who comes along, so that was nice.
When you became the chair of the board in 2014, the Institute celebrated 90 years of existence, right? Now we are approaching the centennial anniversary of the Institute. What are your memories of your service on the board, maybe some friendships that you established? What would you like to add?
I feel like my partnership with David Stern was just so successful and so rewarding, I think, for both of us. I know from my side. He often refers to me in very positive ways as somebody he relied on for mentorship, but I think it was much more of a partnership. And he worked seamlessly with the board, the whole management team. I have never seen on any board that I've served on, maybe not any, but it's pretty exceptional to have such a seamless relationship between the management team and the board of directors. It was very, very effective partnership. As I mentioned, there was some doubt on the side of management when we brought in the strategic plan, but there was confidence that the board knew something and that maybe they ought to give this a try. And anytime we were trying to do something new or were encouraging David to step outside of his comfort zone, he did it with zeal. There was never, that hesitation or concern that maybe he shouldn't step outside that zone. So it was a terrific, terrific partnership. And the board of directors consists of people that come from very different backgrounds, very diverse set of opinions, yet it was always a very respectful debate, and the fact that those diversity of opinions existed there meant that we came to better conclusions. And we worked together as a real team. The board of directors was a very collegial group. Over the course of my long time there, I recommended several people for the board, some of whom are still there. I loved the opportunity to provide for somebody else the opportunity that Ezra provided for me. I knew I was bringing them into a really exciting, dynamic, interesting opportunity to be a part of the BTI family.
Is there anything you would like to mention that you are the most proud of as an achievement, during your time as the chair of the board?
The entire time over the course of my chairmanship of the board, I feel like the collaboration, the continued ongoing collaboration, and that culture of teamwork and that respectful debate, respectful desire to come to the best solution even when everybody didn't agree going in. I think it was more that culture than any specific one thing. It was the way that things worked so well. And I think everybody was having a great time. Even when there were challenges, everybody was having a good time and understood that we were all pulling together to serve BTI most successfully.
Okay, thank you, Laura, for your service on the board, and thank you for your participation. Thank you.
Thank you.